Sometimes I sit late in the evening and think about how easily history could have turned. One wrong decision, one coincidence, and everything goes down a completely different path. And today I want to talk to you about one of the most important crossroads in the history of our country, about the moment when Russia stood at a turning point, and about what might have happened if everything had gone differently. Imagine the autumn of 1917th year. Russia is bleeding out in the First World War. The economy is bursting at the seams. There are lines for bread in the cities, and soldiers on the front are tired of fighting for who knows what. The February Revolution had already swept away the 300-year-old Romanov monarchy like a house of cards. The Tsar abdicated, and now the country is governed by the Provisional Government, a strange collection of intellectuals who sincerely believe in democracy but completely fail to understand how to govern a vast empire amid chaos. And next to them, the Soviets arise, these spontaneous organs of power for workers and soldiers, appearing literally out of thin air in every city. And here it is, the famous situation of dual power, where no one truly understands who is actually in charge. Dozens of political parties and movements are active in this turmoil. Here you have the cadets, Western-style liberals dreaming of transforming Russia into something like France or England. Here are the socialist revolutionaries who want to distribute land to the peasants and build some kind of special Russian socialism. Here are the Mensheviks, also socialists but more moderate, willing to act gradually and legally. There are monarchists who have not reconciled themselves to the fall of the Tsar and dream of restoration. And there are generals and officers who simply want order and discipline at any cost. And among all these forces, the Bolsheviks emerge, a small but highly organized party of radicals led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. They promise the people what everyone craves right now: peace for the soldiers, land for the peasants, bread for the workers, power to the Soviets. Simple slogans that everyone understands. And most importantly, they are ready to act decisively, without hesitation. But here is what is surprising. The success of the Bolsheviks was not predetermined. Now, looking from our time, it seems that everything was inevitable. But back then, in the autumn of the 17th year, history could have easily turned in a completely different direction. Let us think about those moments when everything hung in the balance. Imagine that Lenin could not have returned to Russia in the spring of the 17th. The Germans allowed him passage through their territory in a sealed train car because they hoped he would cause turmoil in Russia and force it to withdraw from the war. But what if the German command had changed its mind? What if the train car had been stopped at the border? Without Lenin, the Bolsheviks would have been much weaker. He was the core, that iron will which drove the party forward. Or let us take another moment. In July of that same year, the Bolsheviks attempted to seize power, but the attempt failed. The Provisional Government accused Lenin of espionage on behalf of Germany, and he was forced to go into hiding. He could very well have been caught and arrested, and then there would have been no October uprising. And do you remember the story with General Kornilov? In the autumn, he attempted to stage a military coup, moving troops toward Petrograd to restore order and disperse the Soviets. If he had succeeded, a military dictatorship would have been established, and the Bolsheviks simply would not have been given a chance. But the coup failed, and the Provisional Government, defending itself against Kornilov, handed out weapons to the workers, including the Bolsheviks. There is the irony of history for you, and even the October uprising itself, it too might not have succeeded. It was an incredibly risky undertaking. If the Provisional Government had acted more decisively, if it had had loyal troops, if the cadets had defended the Winter Palace just a little more stubbornly, the uprising would have failed, and then the Bolsheviks would have remained in history as just another radical group that tried and lost. Do you understand what I'm talking about? History does not flow along rails like a train. It is more like a turbulent river with many channels, and at any moment it can turn one way or the other. And now we will try to imagine what would have happened if the river of our history had flowed differently. This is not just a game of imagination. It is a way to better understand what actually happened. When we think about alternatives, we begin to see how much depended on coincidences, on the personal decisions of specific people, on lucky or unlucky chances. We understand that history was not predetermined, that it had no inevitable goal or direction. And the main question I want to explore with you: what might Russia have been like without 70 years of Soviet power? Without collectivization and Stalinist-style industrialization? Without repression and the Gulag? Without the Iron Curtain and the Cold War? But also without Soviet achievements in space, in education, in science? Was a democratic Russia built on the Western model possible? Or would the country inevitably have slid towards some form of authoritarianism, just a different non-Soviet type? Could the monarchy have been preserved, even if constitutional? Or would a military dictatorship have become the only way to prevent the vast empire from collapsing? And now imagine this picture. The Provisional Government finds the strength to continue the war until the end, concluding an honorable peace with Germany as one of the victors. Russia participates in the Versailles Conference, receiving contributions and territories. A parliamentary republic with many parties is gradually built up in the country. An agrarian reform is carried out. Peasants receive land, but peacefully, without dispossession of the wealthy peasants. Industry develops with the attraction of Western capital. An educated middle class grows. The Russian culture of the Silver Age does not end abruptly due to repression, but continues to flourish. Or another option. General Kornilov or someone like him establishes a military dictatorship. Order is established with a firm hand, and all revolutionary movements are suppressed. The country modernizes following the example of Atatürk's Turkey, or even Germany, quickly, harshly, from above. The army remains the main force. Parliament, if it exists at all, is decorative. But the economy develops, factories and roads are built, and the standard of living rises. Or a third path. Monarchists win the Civil War, which still begins, but proceeds differently. Someone from the Romanov family returns to the throne, perhaps Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, or even Michael Alexandrovich. A constitutional monarchy based on the English model is established. The church restores its influence. The nobility is preserved, although with reduced privileges. Russia remains a conservative, traditional empire, but with elements of modernity. Each of these paths has its pros and cons. Each of them could have led to its own tragedies and achievements. And we will now try to walk along these roads that never were. We will try to imagine how the economy would have developed, how people would have lived, what the culture would have been like, what our country would look like today if, back then, in the distant 17th, history had turned differently. This does not mean that I want to rewrite history or say what would have been better. No, I am simply inviting you on an intellectual stroll along the paths that remained untrodden, to better understand what actually happened, to see the entire complexity and multifaceted nature of the historical process. So, settle in, and let us imagine together what Russia could have been. Let us imagine the most optimistic scenario, the one that Russian liberals and moderate socialists dreamed of, the path that many European countries followed after the First World War, a democratic Russia built on the principles of parliamentarism, freedom, and gradual reforms. For this path to become possible, the Provisional Government needed to solve the main problem that ruined it in real history, the question of the war. Let us imagine that in the autumn of the 17th year, what was so sorely lacking happens: political wisdom and compromise. Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky, who headed the government, finds common ground with the moderate socialists, the Mensheviks, and the right socialist revolutionaries. They understand that they need to act decisively, but not radically. Instead of continuing a senseless offensive, as happened in the summer, the government announces a transition to defense. Soldiers at the front are told honestly, "We are defending our native land from the German invasion. A few more months of patience, and the war will end. At the same time, negotiations with the Allies for an early peace are taking place behind the scenes. And when Germany capitulates in November of the 18th year, Russia finds itself among the victors. This changes everything. The country does not exit the war in shame, does not sign the humiliating Treaty of Brest, and does not lose vast territories. On the contrary, Russian diplomats traveled to Paris for the Versailles Conference along with representatives of England, France, and America. Yes, Russia is exhausted by the war, but it endured. And now it can hope for reparations from Germany and for international loans for reconstruction. You know, in real history, many European countries went through incredible trials after the First World War, but managed to build democratic systems. Germany, despite all the problems of the Weimar Republic, lived under parliamentarism for 14 years. Czechoslovakia became a prosperous democracy. The Baltic states gained independence and freedom. Why shouldn't Russia follow this path? And so, in our alternative history, in the 19th year, elections for the Constituent Assembly, which should have taken place even earlier, finally occur. These are not the elections that took place in reality, the results of which the Bolsheviks simply dispersed. No, now the Constituent Assembly is working. It adopts the constitution of the new democratic Russia. Imagine this scene. Hundreds of deputies from different parties and regions are meeting in a huge hall. Here are the cadets, westernizing liberals dreaming of a constitutional state. Here are the socialist revolutionaries representing the peasantry, the most numerous part of the population. Here are the Mensheviks, speaking on behalf of the workers. There are representatives of the national peripheries, Poles, Ukrainians, Finns, Caucasian peoples. Heated debates, compromises, and deals take place. But ultimately, a document defining the country's future is born. Russia becomes a parliamentary republic. A strong parliament is elected by universal suffrage. The government is formed from representatives of the parties that gained the majority. The president primarily plays a ceremonial role. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly are guaranteed. The church is separated from the state but is not persecuted. Cultural autonomy is granted to national minorities. But the most important thing is that the land question is resolved. That very painful issue that had tormented Russia for centuries. In real history, the Bolsheviks simply confiscated all landowners' land and distributed it to the peasants, and then took it back through collectivization. But in our scenario, everything happens differently, civilized, according to law. A large-scale land reform is carried out. Landowners' latifundia are bought out by the state, yes, with compensation, so as not to turn the nobility into deadly enemies of the new government. This land is distributed among the peasants, not to the commune as before, but into private ownership. Each peasant family receives its own plot, which they can cultivate, sell, and pass on by inheritance. This is a continuation of the very Stolypin reform that began even before the revolution. Pyotr Arkadyevich Stolypin dreamed of creating a class of strong, property-owning peasants in Russia who would become the backbone of the state. Now this dream is fully realized. After several years, the Russian countryside is transformed. Prosperous farmers emerge who apply new methods of agriculture, buy machinery, and increase harvests. Of course, there are problems. Some peasants sell their land and move to the city. Others, conversely, buy up neighbors' land and become large farmers. Property stratification and social tension arise. But there is none of the nightmare of collectivization, which in real history claimed millions of lives and undermined agriculture for decades. Meanwhile, economic life is bustling in the cities. Even before the revolution, Russia was on the rise. The rates of industrial growth were among the highest in the world. Factories were built, railways were laid, oil was extracted in Baku, and the textile industry developed. All of this was interrupted by the war and the revolution. Now, in our alternative, this process resumes. Moreover, it accelerates thanks to foreign investments. Western companies, seeing that Russia has stabilized, eagerly invest money. French banks provide credit. English firms build factories. American engineers arrive to set up production. This is not colonial exploitation, as some might think. This is mutually beneficial cooperation. Russia receives capital and technology that it lacks. The West gains access to a huge market and natural resources. A new class of Russian entrepreneurs emerges, learning from Western partners and gradually creating their own companies. Industry grows. In Petrograd, Moscow, and the Urals, the smokestacks of new factories are billowing. Machine tools, locomotives, and textiles are produced. The oil industry develops. Baku becomes one of the main centers of oil production in the world. Power stations are built. Russia enters the era of electrification, but without crazy projects like the diversion of Siberian rivers. The urban population is also growing. A numerous middle class appears: engineers, doctors, teachers, office workers, skilled laborers. These people live in new apartment buildings, wear European clothes, read newspapers, and go to the cinema and theaters. They become the social support of democracy because they have something to lose. And cultural life. Imagine that there was no cultural break of the 20th year, when a huge part of the intelligentsia emigrated or was destroyed. The Silver Age of Russian culture does not end tragically, but continues, evolves, and is enriched. Anna Andreevna Akhmatova writes her poems without fear of arrest. Marina Ivanovna Tsvetaeva does not hang herself during evacuation, but continues to create. Osip Emilievich Mandelstam does not perish in a camp, but publishes new collections. Sergei Prokofiev and Igor Stravinsky are not just emigrants, but musicians freely traveling between Russia and Europe. The Russian avant-garde in painting continues to develop. Kazimir Malevich, Vasily Kandinsky, Marc Chagall exhibit both in Russia and abroad. New artistic movements and creative associations emerge. Cinematography, which became an instrument of propaganda in the USSR, develops as a free art. Both entertaining films and serious dramas are made. Theaters flourish. Konstantin Sergeyevich Stanislavski continues to lead the art theater, developing his famous system. Vsevolod Emilievich Meyerhold stages avant-garde performances. New directors, actors, and playwrights appear. Science also does not stand still. Russian scientists, unconstrained by ideological boundaries, freely exchange ideas with Western colleagues. They travel to conferences, publish in international journals, and receive grants. Russia contributes to world science in physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics. But let us be honest, not everything is so cloudless. Democracy, especially a young one, is fragile. And in the 20s and 30s, serious trials await Russia. The first crisis may occur as early as the beginning of the 20s. Post-war devastation, economic difficulties, social tension. Workers are dissatisfied with low wages and organize strikes. In some places, peasants seize landowners' land without waiting for official reform. National peripheries demand autonomy or even independence. Attempts at military coups are possible. Some general decides that parliamentary chatter is incapable of restoring order and moves troops toward the capital. Or, conversely, radical leftists raise an uprising, dreaming of a socialist revolution. The government has to maneuver, suppress rebellions, and seek compromises. Then comes the global economic crisis of the late 20s and early 30s. The Great Depression hits all countries, and Russia is no exception. Enterprises close, unemployment rises, and the standard of living falls. This is fertile ground for extremist movements. Right-wing radicals may gain strength, Russian fascists or monarchists promising to establish an iron order. Communists who have not disappeared and are waiting for their hour may become active. Parliament fractures, governments change one after another, and political instability grows. But let us imagine that democracy survives, that Russian politicians, despite all disagreements, understand the value of freedom and compromise, that the middle class, the army, and the intelligentsia support the democratic system. By the middle of the 30s, the crisis passes and the economy begins to recover. And now a new threat appears on the horizon: Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler comes to power, begins rearmament, annexes Austria, and seizes Czechoslovakia. Europe stands on the brink of a new Great War. What role does Russia play in this drama? In real history, the USSR was isolated. Western countries regarded it with suspicion and fear. Stalin concluded a pact with Hitler, dividing Eastern Europe. But in our alternative, everything is different. Democratic Russia is a natural ally of Western democracies. It shares common values with France and England. It sees a mortal threat in Nazi Germany. Russian diplomats are working to create a system of collective security. Perhaps an anti-Hitler coalition is created even before the war begins. Russia, France, England, maybe Poland warn Hitler: if you attack one of us, you will get a war on two fronts. This could have stopped German aggression, or at least the war would have begun under conditions more favorable to the Allies. This is the path Russia could have taken if the Provisional Government had retained power. A slow, difficult path, full of crises and compromises, but a path to a free society, to economic prosperity, to integration into European civilization. A path without millions of victims of repression, without the Gulag, without the Iron Curtain. But democracy is a fragile thing, especially in a country where czars ruled for centuries, where the people were accustomed to a firm hand, where the concepts of freedom and order often seem incompatible. And now I want to tell you about another path, a harsher, more authoritarian one, but oddly enough, perhaps more realistic for Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. Let us return to that very August-September of the 17th year. General Lavr Georgievich Kornilov, the army commander, a war hero, a man of iron will, looks at what is happening in the country and understands. Things cannot continue like this. The army is disintegrating, soldiers are deserting, and chaos reigns at the front. There are endless rallies and strikes in the cities. The Provisional Government speaks beautifully but can do nothing. The country is plunging into the abyss, and Kornilov decides to act. In our alternative scenario, his plan succeeds. Loyal troops move toward Petrograd. Kerensky tries to organize resistance, distributes weapons to the workers, and even calls on the Bolsheviks for help. But this time, everything goes differently. Perhaps the railway workers do not sabotage the troop transport. Perhaps Kornilov has more support in the capital. Perhaps Kerensky himself loses the will to resist at the decisive moment. And so, on one autumn day, the Cossacks and officers enter Petrograd. The Provisional Government is arrested or has fled. Kornilov announces the introduction of martial law. He speaks simply and directly: "I have come not to destroy, but to save Russia. Order will be restored at any cost." Imagine the atmosphere of those days. Military patrols are on the streets. A curfew is announced. Revolutionary newspapers are shut down. The Soviets are dispersed. Activists of leftist parties are arrested. Bolsheviks, anarchists, radical socialist revolutionaries. Some are shot on the spot for rebellion and looting. Others are sent to prisons. It is harsh, it is bloody, but it stops the chaos. Kornilov is not a Democrat. He is an old-school military man, a convinced monarchist and patriot. For him, the main thing is the greatness and unity of Russia. He does not believe in parliaments and elections. He believes in discipline, hierarchy, and strong authority, and this is exactly the kind of power he establishes. Formally, some kind of government might be created, perhaps even a consultative council of representatives from different estates and professions. But the real power is concentrated in the hands of the military junta, a group of generals and officers led by the dictator. Kornilov becomes the de facto ruler of Russia, although he might not bear the official title of monarch or president. Simply the supreme ruler, the commander-in-chief, the savior of the fatherland. One of his first tasks is to end the war, but not in the way the Bolsheviks did, by signing the humiliating Treaty of Brest. Kornilov rallies the troops, restoring discipline in the army with the harshest methods. Desertion means execution by firing squad. Disobeying an officer means execution by firing squad. Distributing defeatist leaflets means execution by firing squad. It is terrible, but it works. By the autumn of the 18th year, when Germany suffers defeat on the Western Front anyway, Russia still holds the front in the east. And when the Germans capitulate, Russia, albeit barely, can be considered a victor. Kornilov's diplomats go to Versailles, demanding their share of the spoils. But the situation inside the country remains explosive. Revolutionary sentiments have not disappeared. They are simply driven deep underground. Uprisings flare up in some regions. Red partisans retreat into the forests and continue the struggle. Something like a civil war begins, but completely different from the one in real history. Here there is no Bolshevik state that needs to be overthrown. Here there is a military dictatorship that brutally suppresses any resistance. The Reds are scattered, deprived of central leadership and resources. The Whites, conversely, control the center, have an army, and receive support from the Allies. The war lasts several years, but the outcome is predetermined. By the beginning of the 20s, the military dictatorship wins, and now Kornilov faces the question, what to do next? The country is devastated by wars, the economy is in ruins, industry is operating at half capacity, and the countryside is impoverished. Modernization is needed. Agrarian Russia must be transformed into a modern industrial power. But how? And here Kornilov looks at the experience of another country, Turkey. There, after the First World War, a military man, Mustafa Kemal, who adopted the name Atatürk, father of the Turks, came to power. He also established an authoritarian regime. He also brutally suppressed Islamic traditionalists and separatists. But at the same time, he carried out radical modernization, abolished the caliphate, introduced secular legislation, reformed education, gave rights to women, and switched the writing system to Latin script. Turkey made a leap from the Middle Ages to the 20th century in 2 decades. Kornilov thinks, why not do the same in Russia? Modernization from above, under military control, without asking the people, without conducting long parliamentary debates, but simply ordering and monitoring execution. Industrialization begins, but not like Stalin's, with collectivization and millions of victims. Kornilov is more pragmatic. He attracts foreign capital and concludes concessions with Western companies. American and European firms build factories in Russia, extract oil, and lay roads. In return, they receive profits, but under strict state control. State corporations are created in key sectors: metallurgy, machine building, transport, energy. The best engineers and managers are sent there, often from among former officers. Military discipline is transferred to production. A plan is a plan. It must be fulfilled at any cost. Workers live in barracks conditions, work for 12 hours, and receive modest pay. Strikes are forbidden and brutally suppressed, but at the same time they are guaranteed work, housing, and minimal social protection. The state builds workers' settlements, schools, and hospitals. A system of militarized paternalism is created. We take care of you, but you must obey. Reforms are also carried out in the countryside, but cautiously. Land is transferred to the peasants, but not to collective farms, but into private hands. Large model farms are created under state management, which are intended to serve as an example. The best peasants receive loans to buy machinery, fertilizers, and pedigree livestock. The worst remain poor, but no one dispossesses them or sends them into exile. After 10 to 15 years, Russia truly changes. New factories and plants grow up. The production of cast iron, steel, and machines increases manifold. Roads, bridges, and power stations are built. Cities grow and industrial infrastructure emerges. In terms of growth rates, the country lags behind Stalin's industrialization, but it avoids mass famine and repression. Culture and education are also under control. This is not the Soviet ideological machine, but neither is it liberal freedom. The state promotes the ideas of patriotism, discipline, and service to the motherland. Censorship exists, but it is not so total. One can write novels and poems if they do not call for the overthrow of the government. One can make films, but they must be patriotic. The church has its rights restored because it teaches obedience and traditional values. Science develops pragmatically. Money is allocated for what is useful for defense and industry, physics, chemistry, engineering. Humanities exist, but under supervision. Scientists can travel abroad, but under control. Overall, this resembles Bismarck's German Empire, authoritarian, but modern. And what happens with politics? Two options for evolution are possible. The first is that the regime becomes increasingly harsh, totalitarian, especially if, in the 30s, Kornilov or his successors look to fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. There, too, is strong authority, discipline, cult of the leader, and militarism. Russian fascism appears, with its own symbols, party, youth organizations, and mass parades. The second option is gradual liberalization. As the country grows richer, the educated middle class grows, and people begin to demand more freedoms. The military realizes that they must give the people an outlet, or the country will explode. Elections are introduced, albeit limited ones. Loyal parties are permitted. Censorship is relaxed. Russia slowly transforms into an authoritarian, but not totalitarian, country. Foreign policy is also interesting. Kornilov's Russia is an empire that does not abandon its ambitions. It demands respect from its neighbors and seeks to control spheres of influence. Relations with the West are complex. On the one hand, economic cooperation. On the other, ideological mistrust. There might be rivalry with Japan in the Far East. With Germany, first enmity, but then possibly rapprochement based on anti-Western sentiments. With Poland and the Baltic countries, tension because Russia does not want to lose influence. The national peripheries are held with an iron fist. No independence for Ukraine, the Caucasus, or Central Asia. Any separatist movements are suppressed by troops. A policy of Russification is carried out, but without genocide. Local elites can enter the system if they are loyal. By the end of the 30s, this is a strong militarized power, not as powerful as Stalin's USSR, but also not as isolated, capable of playing its role in world politics. And when the Second World War begins, its position could prove decisive. This is such a path, harsh, authoritarian, but leading to modernization. A path where order is more important than freedom, and force is more important than law. Many countries in the 20th century went through this, and Russia could well have followed it. And now let us talk about something completely different, about a path that seemingly was impossible after the February Revolution, but which could nevertheless have been realized under certain circumstances. About the return of the monarchy, about the restoration of the very power that ruled Russia for 300 years and collapsed in a matter of days. You know, there have been amazing turns in history. In the 17th century, the English executed their king, lived under the rule of the dictator Cromwell, and then decided to bring back the monarchy. The French overthrew the Bourbons, survived the revolution and Napoleon, and then also restored royal power. Only briefly, it is true, but still. Why couldn't something similar happen in Russia? Imagine that the Civil War ends with the victory of the white movement. Not the Bolsheviks prevail, but those who fought under the three-colored flag of old Russia. The armies of Denikin, Kolchak, Yudenich, and Wrangel achieve victories. The Reds are routed, their leaders executed or fled abroad. Soviet power, having lasted for 1 or 2 years, becomes only a terrible memory. And now the white generals and officers, having captured Moscow and Petrograd, face the question, what to do next? They fought not just against the Bolsheviks, they fought for old Russia, for the country where there were the Tsar, the church, the nobility, and the traditional way of life. Many of them are convinced monarchists. For them, a republic is a Western invention, alien to the Russian soul, and the movement for the restoration of the monarchy begins. Officers, Cossacks, nobility, clergy, merchants, all those who lost their position after the revolution demand the return of the legitimate sovereign. Monarchist congresses are held, organizations are created, and appeals are printed. The Russian people, they say, cannot live without a czar. It is in our genes, in our history, in our faith. But whom should they place on the throne? After all, Emperor Nicholas II abdicated. Moreover, in our alternative history, the Bolsheviks still managed to execute him and the entire royal family in Ekaterinburg while they still controlled the Urals. The Romanov dynasty is interrupted in the direct line, and here claimants arise. The first is Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, the younger brother of Nicholas II. Remember, Nicholas abdicated not only for himself, but also for his sick son Alexei, and transferred the throne to his brother. Michael then, in March of the 17th year, did not accept the crown, saying that the decision should be made by the Constituent Assembly, but this did not mean a final refusal. Michael Alexandrovich is an interesting figure. He is more liberal than his brother, more modern, and more prone to compromise. He understands that it is impossible to return to autocracy in its pure form. A constitution, parliament, and guarantees of rights are needed. If the whites place him on the throne, it will be a different monarchy, limited, constitutional. But there is also another candidate, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, a cousin of Nicholas II. He is older, more experienced, and importantly, he is the only one of the Grand Dukes who openly declared himself a supporter of the new government during the Revolution, and then, in emigration, proclaimed himself emperor. He has his own party of monarchists, his own supporters. He is more conservative, harsher, and less inclined to compromise with democracy. Rivalry arises between these two camps. Some white generals support Michael, others support Kirill. Negotiations, intrigues, and even threats of a new civil war take place. But in the end, a compromise is reached. Maybe Michael wins, as the more legitimate. Maybe Kirill, as the more decisive. Or even someone third from the dynasty. Let us assume that Michael Alexandrovich ascends the throne, taking the name Michael II. The coronation takes place in Moscow, in the Assumption Cathedral of the Kremlin, according to all the ancient rites. The Patriarch, the Orthodox Church has already restored the Patriarchy, places the cap of monomach on his head. Bells ring, people shout hurrah, and officers salute with sabers. Russia has once again become a monarchy. But this is no longer the monarchy that existed under Nicholas II. The new Tsar understands, to hold on to the throne, things must change. And so, the constitution of the restored Russian Empire is adopted. Great Britain serves as the model. There too is a monarch, but the real power rests with the parliament. A two-chamber parliament is created. The upper chamber, the State Council, is formed partly by the appointment of the Tsar, partly by hereditary principle from the nobility. The lower chamber, the State Duma, is elected on the basis of quite broad suffrage. Perhaps not entirely universal. There may be a property or educational qualification, but still, millions of people receive the right to vote. The Tsar remains the head of state, the supreme commander-in-chief, and the embodiment of national unity. He appoints the government, but it must have the support of the majority in the Duma. He can veto laws, but the Duma can override that veto. He represents Russia on the international stage, receives foreign ambassadors, and signs treaties. Political parties are permitted, though not all. Radical leftists are banned, but conservative monarchical parties, liberal constitutionalists, and moderate populists can operate. Elections are held, governments are formed, and parliamentary debates take place. This is not complete democracy, but it is not absolutism either. The Church regains its special position. Orthodoxy once again becomes the state religion. The Patriarch is one of the most important figures in the country. The clergy receives state support. Churches are built and restored. Religious education is introduced in schools. Monasteries recover their lands and property, but religious tolerance is maintained. Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Jews can freely profess their faith. Orthodoxy simply holds a privileged status as the foundation of Russian national identity. The nobility also has its rights restored. Those who lost estates receive them back or receive compensation. Titles, coats of arms, and privileges are returned. Nobles once again occupy important posts in the army, administration, and diplomacy. Balls, receptions, and ceremonies resume at court. All this seems anachronistic in the 20th century, but for many, it is a symbol of a return to normalcy. The land question is resolved by compromise. Part of the landowner's land is still given to the peasants. Otherwise, the countryside will explode. But not for free, rather, through a buyout stretched over decades. Large estates are preserved, especially those where advanced farming is conducted. Landowners remain an important force in the agrarian economy. The economy develops slower than in other scenarios. After all, many archaic structures are preserved. Huge resources are spent on maintaining the court, the church, and the nobility. Part of the land is withdrawn from active circulation. Peasants pay redemption payments instead of investing in their farms. But there are also advantages. Political stability attracts foreign investors. The monarchy provides a sense of order and continuity. Industry grows, especially in large cities. New factories, banks, and trading companies emerge. Russian entrepreneurs, often from merchant and noble families, create industrial empires. Culture experiences an amazing flourishing. After all, there was no cultural break, no emigration, and no repression. The Silver Age continues. Moreover, a cultural restoration arises, a return to pre-Petrine, ancient Russian traditions. Artists paint in the style of icon painting, architects build in the pseudo-Russian style, and composers write music based on church chants. At the same time, Russia does not close itself off from the world. The intelligentsia travels to Europe, studies at Western universities, and brings back new ideas. An interesting synthesis arises. Traditional values are combined with modern forms, monarchy with parliament, orthodoxy with scientific progress, nobility with entrepreneurship. By the 30s, this is a stable, conservative power. Not the richest, not the strongest, but having its own face, its own identity. A country where the past is not destroyed, but carefully preserved and interwoven into the present. Where the Tsar is on the throne, churches are full of worshippers, and old nobles are living out their days in their estates, remembering bygone times. This is the path of conservative modernization, slow, cautious, but steady. A path where tradition is more important than progress, and stability is more important than change. And now let us talk about money, about factories and plants, about fields and harvests, about how people earn a living and what they can afford. Because history is not just politics and wars. It is also the economy, which determines how millions of ordinary people live. And now I want to show you what Russia's economy could have been like if it had gone down a different path. You know, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was experiencing a real economic boom. We now remember it as a backward agrarian country, but in reality, the rates of industrial growth were incredible. From 1892nd to 1914th year, the volume of industrial production grew almost 4 times. New factories, mines, and power stations appeared. Thousands of kilometers of railways were built. Coal mining, steel smelting, machinery production, everything grew rapidly. And what is especially important, this growth largely occurred thanks to foreign investments. French bankers readily provided loans to the Russian government and private companies. French capital built metallurgical factories in Ukraine and coal mines in Donbass. The British invested in the oil industry and textile factories. The Belgians built tram lines in Russian cities. The Germans established chemical enterprises. This was not colonial exploitation, as in Africa or Asia. This was a partnership, albeit an unequal one. The West received profit, but Russia received what it desperately lacked: capital and technology. And most importantly, Russian engineers and entrepreneurs learned, gained experience, and created their own companies. Imagine that this process was not interrupted by revolutions and wars. That after a short period of turmoil in the 17th to 19th years, the economy began to grow again. It does not matter which scenario was realized: democratic, authoritarian, or monarchical. In any case, stable power creates conditions for economic development. And so, Western investors look at Russia again. They see a huge market of 150 million people. They see the richest natural resources. They see cheap labor, and they start investing money. Moreover, now, after the First World War, Americans are added to the French and British. They have huge capital, and they are looking for where to invest it. In the 20s, large Western corporations come to Russia. American automotive companies build factories near Moscow and in Nizhny Novgorod. Not as gigantic as the future Soviet car factories, but quite modern enterprises. The production of trucks, passenger cars, and buses begins. First under license, then proprietary models are developed. Metallurgical factories in the Urals and Donbass are modernized with the help of foreign engineers. New technologies for steel smelting are introduced. The quality and volume of products increase. Russian steel begins to compete in world markets. And oil. The Baku fields at the beginning of the century provided more than half of the world's oil production. Then, due to wars and revolutions, production dropped. But in our alternative history, it quickly recovers. Foreign companies, British, American, Dutch, receive concessions to develop the fields. Oil refineries, pipelines, and tankers are built. Baku turns into a real oil Klondike. Engineers, workers, and entrepreneurs from all over the world flock there. Modern neighborhoods with European architecture, luxurious mansions of oil magnates, and workers' settlements emerge. Local Azerbaijanis grow rich, receiving a share of the oil revenues. And the Russian treasury is replenished through taxes and duties. Light industry is also developing. Textile factories in Ivanovo-Voznesensk, Moscow, and Petrograd operate at full capacity. New equipment is purchased, and modern production methods are introduced. Russian textiles go not only to the domestic market, but also for export to Central Asia, Iran, and China. Railways continue to be built. The Trans-Siberian Railway, which connected Moscow with Vladivostok even before the revolution, acquires branches. Lines are laid to Central Asia, the Caucasus, and remote corners of Siberia. This not only binds the country together, but also opens up new territories for development, for mineral extraction, and for agriculture. Ports are being built on the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Pacific Ocean. Through them, grain, timber, oil, and ore are exported. Machinery, equipment, and luxury goods are imported. Russia integrates into the world economy, becoming an important link in international trade. And what happens in the countryside? Here, everything depends on which path the country took. But in any case, there is no Stalinist collectivization. Peasants are not forcibly driven into collective farms. The last grain is not taken away. An artificial famine claiming millions of lives is not arranged. Instead, there is a gradual modernization of agriculture. The Stolypin reform, begun even before the revolution, continues and deepens. Peasants receive land in private ownership, leave the commune, and create individual farms. The most enterprising buy additional plots, hire workers, and become true farmers. The state and private banks provide loans for buying machinery. The first tractors, threshing machines, and seeders arrive in the countryside. At first, there are few of them, and they are expensive, but every year more and more peasants can afford this. Machine and tractor stations are created, leasing equipment. Agricultural cooperatives appear, but voluntary, not compulsory. Peasants unite to collectively purchase fertilizers, sell the harvest, and receive loans. This increases efficiency, while private ownership of land is maintained. Agronomists who have graduated from agricultural institutes travel to the countryside, teaching peasants new methods of soil cultivation, crop rotation, and pest control. Yields gradually increase, not at the frantic pace promised by Soviet propaganda, but steadily, year after year. After 20 to 30 years, the Russian countryside changes greatly. The terrible poverty that was characteristic of Tsarist Russia disappears. Peasant houses become sturdier and more spacious. Purchased items appear in them: watches, sewing machines, dishes, tools. Children go to schools, and the most capable go to gymnasiums and even universities. Yes, stratification exists. Some peasants become rich, others remain poor, and a third group leaves for the cities entirely. But there is none of the mass impoverishment and famine brought by collectivization. The middle class is growing in the cities. These are engineers, doctors, teachers, lawyers, accountants, skilled laborers, and small entrepreneurs. They receive stable salaries, can rent or even buy housing, and save money. Their children study in good schools and acquire professions. Private entrepreneurship develops. Stores, workshops, small factories, transport companies, restaurants, and hotels open. A person with an idea and a small amount of capital can start their own business. Not everyone succeeds. Many go bankrupt, but the opportunity exists. This is a completely different model of development compared to Soviet industrialization. There, it was fast, harsh, and bloody. In 10 years, the country was transformed from agrarian to industrial, at the cost of millions of lives, a ruined countryside, and the gulag. Giant factories were built, mountains of steel were smelted, but people lived in semi-starvation, in barracks, under constant fear. In our alternative, everything is slower, softer, but also more humane. Growth is not happening at such insane rates. By the end of the 30s, Russia produces less steel and fewer machines than Stalin's USSR. But then again, there are no millions killed. There is no ruined countryside. There is no terror or camps. And importantly, economic growth is sustainable. It is based not on violence and coercion, but on the personal interest of the people. A peasant works on his land because the harvest is his. A worker strives at the factory because he can receive a promotion and a raise. An entrepreneur develops a business because the profit remains with him. Of course, there are problems. Social inequality is vast. Oil magnates live in luxurious mansions, while workers at their fields live in cramped barracks. Large landowners own thousands of hectares, while farm laborers work for pennies. In the cities, there are wealthy neighborhoods with mansions and lawns, and there are slums with poverty and crime. The labor movement does not remain silent. Strikes take place, demanding higher wages, better working conditions, and social guarantees. The authorities have to make concessions. Laws on labor protection, limiting the working day, pensions, and accident insurance are introduced. Gradually, step by step, a system of social protection is built. By the end of the 30s, this is a dynamically developing country. Not the richest in the world, but not destitute either. approximately on the level of southern Europe, Italy, Spain. It lags behind Germany, England, and America, but it is catching up. And most importantly, people live without fear, without terror, and can make plans for the future. And now let us look into the most dramatic moment of our alternative history, the late 30s, when the clouds of war gather over Europe again, when a man whose name became a symbol of absolute evil came to power in Germany. And Russia faces the question, whose side is it on? What will happen if a new global slaughter breaks out? Imagine the year 1939. Europe is taut like a string. Adolf Hitler has already annexed Austria to Germany, has already dismembered Czechoslovakia, and is already demanding Polish territories. England and France, who had long tried to appease the Führer, finally realized that there was nowhere left to retreat. They give guarantees to Poland. If Germany attacks, there will be war. And what about Russia? In real history, Stalin concluded the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler, under which they divided Eastern Europe. The USSR received the Baltics, Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and Bessarabia, and Germany gained a free hand for the war in the West, and important supplies of raw materials, oil, grain, metals. But in our alternative history, everything is different. Here there is no Soviet Russia, isolated from the world, despised and fearing capitalist encirclement. Here there is a Russia that developed alongside Europe for 20 years, traded with it, accepted investments, and exchanged people and ideas. Let us consider, it does not matter whether this Russia is democratic, authoritarian, or monarchical. In any case, it has reason to fear Nazi Germany. Hitler does not hide his plans. He wants to expand Lebensraum, living space, for Germans in the East. And what is in the East? Poland, the Baltics, and further, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. Rich lands, resources, territories. In Hitler's ideology, Slavs are a lower race, subhumans, Untermenschen, who must work for German masters or disappear altogether. Russian culture, Russian statehood, all this is subject to destruction. German colonists must settle the expanses from the Vistula to the Urals. Russian politicians, be they democratic ministers, authoritarian generals, or monarchical advisors, understand this. They read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, where everything is written frankly. They hear the speeches of Nazi leaders. They see what is happening in Germany, militarization, aggression, chauvinism. And they understand, sooner or later Hitler will turn his gaze eastward. But there is another side of the coin. Germany is a powerful state. It has the strongest army in Europe, modern weapons, and a fanatical ideology. Fighting it is scary. Perhaps it is better to try to negotiate, remain neutral, let the Germans fight France and England, and we will watch from the sidelines. Heated debates are taking place in Russian political circles. Some say, we must immediately enter into an alliance with the Western democracies, create an anti-Hitler coalition, and surround Germany. Only this way can the aggressor be stopped. Others object. Why should we interfere in European squabbles? Let them sort it out themselves. We will declare neutrality, fortify the borders, and watch. Let us imagine the first option. Russia joins the alliance with England and France. British and French diplomats arrive in Moscow or Petrograd. Negotiations take place. Mutual assistance treaties are signed. If Germany attacks Poland, Russia commits to striking from the east. This changes the entire balance of power. Hitler sees, if he starts a war, he will have to fight on two fronts simultaneously. In the west, against France and England. In the east, against Russia and Poland. This is exactly what Germany feared in the First World War, and what led to its defeat. Perhaps this would have stopped Hitler. Perhaps he would not have dared to attack Poland, and then the Second World War would not have started in the 39th year. Or it might not have started at all. The Nazi regime could have collapsed from internal contradictions, a general's conspiracy, or economic problems. But another scenario is also possible. Hitler still attacks Poland, hoping that the West will not enter the war or will quickly capitulate. And then, on the 1st of September of the 39th year, the war begins. German tanks enter Poland. England and France declare war on Germany. And Russia also enters the conflict. Russian troops cross the Polish border from the east, but not as occupiers, as happened in real history, but as allies, saving Poland from the German invasion. The battle for Warsaw unfolds. The Germans attack from the west. The Russians help the Poles from the east. How would this war have developed? Here, one must honestly say, the Russian army is weaker than the Red Army was in reality. After all, there was no Stalinist industrialization. No gigantic tank and aviation factories were built. Tens of thousands of tanks, planes, and guns were not produced. The Russian army in our alternative is more traditional. It has modern weapons, purchased or produced under license. There are tanks, perhaps French or English models assembled in Russia. There are planes and artillery, but the quantity is smaller. And most importantly, there is not that experience of mass warfare, that readiness to suffer huge losses for the sake of victory. The Germans fight skillfully. Their blitzkrieg sweeps away the Polish army in a matter of several weeks. Russian troops do not manage to deploy. Warsaw has fallen. Poland is defeated. But Germany's western border remains open for an Anglo-French strike. And this is where the crucial question arises. In real history, France and England did not launch a serious offensive against Germany while it was fighting in Poland. They simply sat behind fortifications. This was called the phony war. And then, in the spring of the 40th year, Hitler struck France and defeated it in 6 weeks. But what if there had been a Russian Anglo-French coalition? What if the Allies had acted in concert? While the Germans were busy in the east, the French could have struck across the Rhine, entering the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heart. The British would have bombed German cities and factories. The Russians would have held the front in Poland or on their own border. Germany would have been caught in a vice. Its resources are not endless. The economy, retooled for war, would have begun to falter. The population would have grown tired of war. Perhaps the war would have ended as early as the 40th or 41st year, without millions of victims, without the Holocaust, without the destruction of half of Europe. But let us also consider the pessimistic scenario. The Allies act indecisively. France is defeated anyway. England remains alone and holds out on the islands. And then, in the summer of the 41st year, Hitler turns the full might of the Wehrmacht against Russia. Operation Barbarossa begins, but in a different version. German tank wedges cut through the Russian defense. Huge masses of troops are encircled. The enemy rushes toward Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev. This is a terrible ordeal. But there are also differences from real history. The Russian army is not decapitated by repressions. Here there was no 37th year when Stalin executed the best generals and officers. Commanders are more experienced and proactive. Troops are better prepared. There is none of the panic and chaos of the first days of the war that existed in reality. And most importantly, the people are fighting for a different country, not for the Stalinist regime which had just starved them and put them in camps, but for their Russia, in which they lived relatively freely, even if not richly, for their homes, their lands, their families. This is a strong motivation. Perhaps the war would have lasted longer. Perhaps the losses would have been different. Fewer prisoners in the first months, but also fewer human resources for a protracted war. In the end, with the support of America, which entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Germany would have been defeated. But this would have been a different victory. And what if Russia had chosen neutrality, declared that it would not interfere in European affairs? Then Hitler would calmly crush Poland, France, and fight England. And then, anyway, in the 41st, he would attack Russia, because he needs resources, territories, and slaves. And Russia faces the war alone, without allies, without lend-lease, without a second front. This would have been the most terrible scenario. After the war, the world would look completely different. There would be no bipolar world with the USSR and the USA. There would be no Cold War, Iron Curtain, or missile crises. Russia would not become a superpower with nuclear weapons and influence over half the world. Eastern Europe would not fall under Soviet control. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania would become democratic, or at least independent states. Germany, possibly, would not be divided into two parts. China would not become communist. After all, Mao Zedong received support from Stalin. Perhaps the Kuomintang would have won there, and China would have developed like Taiwan. The world would be more multipolar, more complex, perhaps more peaceful. And now let us talk about the most important thing, about what makes a country not just a territory with factories and an army, but a living organism with a soul, about culture, about creativity, about how people think, feel, and create beauty. Because, in the end, it is precisely this that remains through the ages, not the quantity of steel smelted, but the poems, music, discoveries, and ideas. Imagine that the cultural catastrophe of the 20th year did not happen, that there was no mass emigration when the best minds of Russia scattered all over the world, that there were no repressions when poets were shot, artists were sent to camps, and scientists were forced to serve the ideology, that there was no Iron Curtain cutting the country off from the world cultural process. The Silver Age of Russian culture, that was an incredible takeoff. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was at the forefront of world art. The poetry of Alexander Alexandrovich Blok, Anna Andreevna Akhmatova, Osip Emilievich Mandelstam, the prose of Andrei Bely, Ivan Alexeyevich Bunin, the painting of Kazimir Malevich, Vasily Kandinsky, Marc Chagall, the music of Igor Stravinsky, Sergei Prokofiev, the theater of Konstantin Sergeyevich Stanislavski, and Vsevolod Emilievich Meyerhold. This was a time of incredible creative freedom, experiments, and searches. Artists created new movements, symbolism, acmeism, futurism, abstractionism. Poets broke traditional forms, seeking new rhythms and images. Composers shocked the public with daring dissonances. Directors rethought the very essence of theater. And so, in our alternative history, all this does not end tragically. The Silver Age does not conclude, but enters a new phase. Those who emigrated or perished in reality continue to create here. Anna Akhmatova does not endure the terrible years when her first husband was executed by firing squad, her son was imprisoned, and she herself was persecuted for lack of ideology. She writes new poems about love, about Russia, about time. She becomes an acknowledged classic during her lifetime. She travels around Europe, meets Western poets, and is translated into various languages. Osip Mandelstam does not die in a transit camp near Vladivostok from hunger and typhus. His sharp tongue, his independence of character, his brilliant poems, all this continues to enrich Russian literature. Perhaps he lives sometimes in Russia, sometimes abroad, like many free artists of that time. Marina Ivanovna Tsvetaeva does not return to the Soviet Union, where she is met with the arrests of loved ones and destitution. She does not hang herself during evacuation in the dreadful 41st year. She lives and writes, perhaps in Paris, perhaps in Prague, perhaps torn between Europe and Russia, but creating her piercing lines. Vladimir Vladimirovich Nabokov does not become a permanent emigrant writing in English. He moves freely between countries, writes in Russian and English, becoming a bridge between cultures. His novels are printed both in Russia and in the West. Ivan Bunin receives the Nobel Prize not as an emigrant who broke with his homeland, but as a great Russian writer, a representative of a huge literary tradition. and he can come to Moscow or Petersburg to bow at the graves of his ancestors, to walk through his favorite places. The development of the avant-garde continues in painting. Malevich writes not only his famous Black Square, but also dozens of other works, developing suprematism. Kandinsky creates his abstract compositions. Chagall flies over the rooftops of his villages, and all of them exhibit in Russian and European galleries. Their works are bought by collectors, and critics write about them. New artistic movements emerge. Someone returns to realism, but enriched by all the experience of the avant-garde. Someone delves into social themes depicting the lives of workers and peasants, but not at the direction of the party, but by their own free will. Someone paints portraits, landscapes, and still lifes, simply enjoying the beauty of the world. Music is also free. Sergei Prokofiev does not vacillate between the West and the USSR, trying to please the Soviet authorities and write correct music. He simply writes what he feels: concertos, symphonies, ballets, operas. His Romeo and Juliet, his piano concertos sound on the best stages in the world. Dmitry Dmitrievich Shostakovich does not live in constant fear that his music will be declared formalist and banned. He does not write his symphonies as a coded protest against tyranny. He freely experiments, seeking his path between tradition and modernism. Jazz and other modern directions emerge. Young people are enthusiastic about new rhythms, dances, and sounds coming from the West. This is not prohibited as bourgeois decay, but accepted as a natural part of world culture. Theater experiences a golden age. Stanislavski continues to develop the art theater, training new generations of actors according to his system. Meyerhold stages avant-garde performances, shocking and delighting. New directors and new theatrical forms emerge, from classics to experimental productions. And cinema. In reality, Soviet cinema was great, despite censorship. Eisenstein, Pudovkin, Dovzhenko created masterpieces. But they worked within rigid frameworks. Cinema had to serve the revolution, educate the new man, and glorify the party. In our alternative, cinema develops more freely. Of course, patriotic films, historical dramas, and classical adaptations are also made here. But entertaining films are also made. Comedies, melodramas, adventures, detective stories. Films about modern life are made without embellishing it. Experimental auteur cinema is made. Russian directors cooperate with Western ones. Actors film in both Russia and Hollywood. Cinema becomes a bridge between cultures, not an instrument of propaganda. Science is also free from ideological pressure. The concepts of bourgeois and proletarian science do not exist. Genetics is not declared a pseudoscience, and geneticists are not imprisoned. Cybernetics is not branded as an imperialist invention. Scientists can freely research what interests them. Russian scientists, physicists, chemists, biologists, mathematicians work in close contact with Western colleagues. They travel to conferences, publish in international journals, receive grants, and work in the best laboratories in the world. And many return to Russia to create their own scientific schools here. Perhaps some Russian scientists receive the Nobel Prize not for dissent, but for scientific achievements. Perhaps Russian science contributes to the great discoveries of the 20th century: quantum mechanics, relativity theory, molecular biology, nuclear physics. Universities are free. Professors teach what they consider correct, not what the party commands. Students read any books, discuss any ideas. The works of Western philosophers, economists, and sociologists stand in the libraries. Young people learn to think critically, rather than memorizing Marxism-Leninism. Religious life is revived. The Orthodox Church, which was almost destroyed during the Soviet era, is preserved here and even strengthened, depending on which scenario was realized. Under the monarchy, the Church regains the status of a state religion. Under democracy, it is separated from the state but enjoys respect and freedom. Destroyed churches are restored and new ones are built. Monasteries are once again filled with monks. Theological academies train priests. The church engages in charity, education, and publishes books. Russian theology, interrupted by the revolution, continues to develop, but religious tolerance is maintained. Catholics, Protestants, Old Believers, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, all have the right to their faith. No one is persecuted for religious beliefs or their absence. Education remains classical or is modernized according to the Western model, depending on the scenario. Perhaps gymnasiums with the study of ancient languages, classical literature, and strict discipline are preserved. Perhaps a more practical system is introduced, focusing on sciences and professional training. But in any case, the education is high quality. Schools and universities prepare educated people capable of thinking, reading, and understanding complex things. Illiteracy gradually disappears. The number of people with higher education increases. And how do the various peoples of the vast empire live together? This is a complex question. Perhaps the national peripheries receive more autonomy, cultural and maybe political as well. Ukrainian, Belarusian, Tatar, Armenian, and Georgian languages and cultures develop freely. Schools open in native languages, books are published, and theaters operate. Or, conversely, a policy of Russification is carried out, soft under democracy, harsh under dictatorship or monarchy. The Russian language is imposed as the only state language. National movements are suppressed. Most likely the truth lies somewhere in the middle. There is a unified state, with Russian as the common language, but with respect for local cultures. The empire is multinational, and this is a richness, not a problem. This is what the cultural life of alternative Russia could have been like. Free, rich, open to the world, but preserving its identity. So, we have walked along these roads that never were. 3 different paths, 3 different Russias. Democratic, authoritarian, monarchical, each with its own merits and shortcomings, with its bright and dark sides. And now, at the end of our journey, I want to stop and think with you. What does all this mean? Which of these paths was the most likely? Honestly, probably not the democratic one. Democracy requires certain conditions: an educated middle class, traditions of parliamentarism, compromise between different groups in society. In Russia, at the beginning of the 20th century, all of this was insufficient. The country had lived under autocracy for centuries. The people had no experience of freedom and self-government. The gap between the educated elite and the common people was enormous. Most likely, Russia would have followed the authoritarian path. A military dictatorship of Kornilov or someone similar seems the most realistic scenario. A strong hand that restores order, suppresses chaos, and carries out modernization from above. This would correspond to Russian historical traditions and would be understandable to the people. This is exactly how many countries of that time developed, from Turkey to Latin America. Monarchical restoration is also possible, but less likely. Tsarist power compromised itself too much. The February Revolution did not happen by chance. The monarchy demonstrated its inability to govern the country at a critical moment. It would have been difficult to bring it back, although under conditions of chaos and nostalgia for old times, this could have occurred. And now let us honestly ask ourselves, would it have been better if the Bolsheviks had not come to power? On the one hand, the answer seems obvious. There would have been no terror, repression, or gulag. There would have been no artificial famine of the 33rd year, which claimed millions of lives. There would have been no mass executions of the 37th and 38th years. There would have been no Iron Curtain, cutting the country off from the world. Millions of people who perished or were crippled by Soviet power could have lived normal lives. There would have been none of that terrible break when the traditional village was destroyed, churches were ruined, and the old intelligentsia was annihilated. Culture would have developed naturally, without breaks or prohibitions. people could have thought freely, created, believed what they wanted, or believed in nothing at all, the economy would have developed more slowly, but more harmoniously. Without insane 5-year plans with their inhuman strain and sacrifices, without gigantic construction projects where prisoners were driven, but with a normal market mechanism, private initiative, and foreign investment. But there is also another side. Soviet industrialization, however terrible it was, transformed an agrarian country into an industrial power in 10 years. Thousands of factories were built, mountains of metal were smelted, and a huge quantity of machines and weapons was produced. And it was precisely this that allowed victory in the Great Patriotic War. Could an alternative Russia have stood up against Hitler's Germany? A complex question. On the one hand, it would have had a better prepared army, not decapitated by repressions. Alliances with the West would have been possible. On the other hand, fewer tanks, planes, and guns. The soldiers would have a different motivation. They would be defending not the Stalinist regime, but there would also not be the mobilization of all resources that the command economy provided. Soviet power provided education to millions of people. Yes, it was ideological education, but it was mass and free. Peasant children could become engineers and scientists. Women received equal rights. A healthcare system was created, perhaps not ideal, but accessible to all. In alternative Russia, all this would have developed more slowly and unevenly. There would have been greater social mobility than under the Tsar, but less than under Soviet power. More inequality and injustice would have remained. And here is the essence. There are no unambiguous answers in history. One cannot say that one path is absolutely better than the other. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages. History knows no subjunctive mood, as the saying goes. But, this is the very meaning of alternative history. Not to prove what would have been better or worse, but to show that things could have been different. When we think about alternatives, we begin to understand that history is not predetermined, that at every moment there were different possibilities, different forks in the road. That much depended on chance, on the decisions of specific people, on luck or misfortune. If the Germans had not allowed Lenin passage to Russia, if Kornilov had succeeded in his coup, if the Provisional Government had acted more decisively, if only, history could have turned completely differently. And this is important to understand, because we live not at the end of history, but in its process. Forks in the road, choices, and alternatives constantly stand before us too, and the future depends on our decisions. History continues, and we are its participants, not just observers. So, thank you for walking with me along these non-existent roads. I hope this journey was interesting and gave you food for thought about the past, about the present, about the future, about how fragile history is, and how much every choice we make matters.